Hello everyone. I recently watched this 2022 adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front. I know I'm a bit late to the party. It's only just in the last couple of weeks been released on DVD. Originally it was launched, as I say, in 2022 by Netflix, which I don't subscribe to, and then in March of this year, 2023, it was brought out on Blu-ray and 4K, neither of which systems I own either, and it's only finally in July that it's come out on DVD and I've been able to watch it. And I thought I would do a video just as a sort of review of it to begin with, but then changed my mind, and I'm going to expand into a kind of look at several film and TV adaptations of some historical novels, and try and make a video out of that, which I hope you'll find interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I'm in two minds about this latest version. The first thing that struck me about it was that it differs quite noticeably from the previous two films adaptations of All Quiet on the Western Front. There was one in 1979, which was produced by Carlson, which was a sort of Lou Grade, I think, company. So it was kind of a TV film. I'm not sure if it was ever released in the cinema, but it was certainly released as a film on ITV. And then there was the 1930 Hollywood version, and this film differs dramatically from the previous two films in terms of the plot. So I wasn't sure. That made me think at the beginning, because these two films are very similar, whether this one was the correct, or not correct, but a more accurate portrayal of the book, the plot of the book, or whether these two were. And I had never read the book before. I've had it on my bookshelf quite a long time. I think I bought this about 3 or 4 years ago, but never actually read the book. So I went back and read the book, and that's what then made me think, this is quite interesting. I might do a sort of similar kind of review of several other TV adaptations of different books. So before I talk about All Quiet on the Western Front, then I'm going to start with another book and expand my kind of theory or hypothesis about TV and film adaptations from that. Okay, so I'm going to start with War and Peace, classic novel by Tolstoy, and I want to sort of present it to you with this sort of triangular relationship. In one corner of the triangle you have history, then you have in the another corner the historical novel, and down the bottom of the triangle here you have film and TV adaptations of that whatever the historical novel is. And there's a triangular, I'd like to suggest there's a triangular relationship between those three categories. Central to the triangle, to begin with, let's talk about the subject of what you could call truth. So history is a very kind of malleable subject. It's constantly being rewritten, and the rewriting of history always takes place through the lens of the period in which the history is being written, not of the period that the history is about. So, as an example of that, then, the, the truth in history is kind of split really between what you could call objective truths and subjective truths. So, objective truths are sort of fairly concrete facts that aren't disputed, aren't debated, and their accuracy is accepted. So they tend to be the less important elements of history. So dates, times and dates, appearances. In the case of let's look at the Napoleonic era now, as we're talking about War and Peace. Military uniforms, that kind of thing. There is you can find an accurate depiction of a military uniform, and not many people are going to debate it. Whereas the merits of Napoleon himself is something that's constantly being discussed and debated, and you have protagonists of Napoleon on one side and detractors of Napoleon on the other. And as I say, that will constantly alter as time goes by. So historians will, for instance, in the 19th century, at the time that Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, War and Peace was written in the 1860s in Russia, but in the 19th century, Europe was in turmoil, and a lot of the turmoil was a consequence of the French conquest of so many of the old empires that controlled Europe at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So the Habsburg Empire, the Austrian Empire, that stretched down into northern Italy and across into the Balkans, and that itself, the territory they had in the Balkans was largely a consequence of them having pushed back the Ottoman Empire. So there was still a rump of the Ottoman Empire in Greece and in the southern Balkans and so on at the time that Tolstoy wrote War and Peace. And the Russian Empire, of course, controlled much of the sort of Baltic states and Poland and so on. And in the middle of the 19th century, there was a very strong kind of nationalist upheaval, where countries that those empires had sort of reacquired after Napoleon's final fall. So places like Greece, places like Poland, were all kind of striving for their independence from their respective empires that had reacquired them. And Napoleon was seen as a sort of almost like a liberator in those countries from those historians' points of view. But equally, there was a very kind of strong nationalist sentiment in Russia, which had been invaded by Napoleon, and he was seen as a sort of totally different character in Russia than he was in other parts of Europe. Later on, of course, obviously, in the 20th century, you have the rise of fascism in Germany and the Second World War and the atrocities and so on of the Second World War, and a lot of historians and a lot of basically national sentiments linked Napoleon with Hitler, and tended to sort of like compare the two of them, especially in the invasion of Russia. Napoleon's reputation was tarnished even further by the actions of the fascists in the Second World War, even though there was very little connection between. You can't draw much of a parallel between Bonaparte and Hitler in terms of their ideologies or their characters and so on. But that's what historians have tended to do. So that would be the sort of subjective side of history. Whereas, as I say, the objective side isn't something that's going to be changed or altered, but the subjective side is constantly being rewritten. Now, Tolstoy, as I say, wrote War and Peace in the. It was fine. It was first published in sort of serial form under a different title in the early 1860s, but I think it finally came out as War and Peace in 1869. Tolstoy, as you'll find with a lot of the other two books that I'm going to talk about, didn't intend simply to write a novel set in a historic period. Yes, that can be what a historical novel is, but all three of the books I'm going to talk to you about, that there is a far greater purpose behind the author writing the novel, simply for them to write a good story set in a historical period. Tolstoy himself was aristocrat, a very sort of liberal thinking person, though, deeply kind of moved by the plight of the peasantry. For instance, in 1861, the Russian serfs had only then been emancipated. Prior to that, they had been virtually slaves on their estates, and the landowners had, the sort of power of life and death over them, and they weren't allowed to leave their land and so on. So they were effectively slaves right up until 1861. And it was only then that the Tsar, the reforming Tsar Alexander II, decided that they needed to do something to bring Russia into the 19th century, as it were. Partly, as I say, because in Europe there had been so much change and transformation it was partly down to Napoleon's conquests of Europe, but also down to the Industrial Revolution and so on. And it was very apparent that Russia was falling behind in that sort of march of science and technology and general kind of historical progress. And so obviously Tolstoy was writing War and Peace right at that point in history, and that comes out very much in War and Peace. One of the central characters in War and Peace, Pierre Bezukhov, clearly has a lot of similarities to Tolstoy himself, to the writer himself, and again that is going to be very much the case in the other two books I'm going to talk to you about. So War and Peace is a very kind of philosophical novel. It deals with the course of Russian history. It's very patriotic in terms of its love of Russia. It expands beyond that, though, into more a love of life, and a love of nature. There's a lot of references to the beauties of nature and the awe-inspiring character of the universe and so on. Lots of quite literally stargazing. There's the appearance of a comet that sort of portends, dramatic events. That kind of thing. Obviously, there's a lot of episodes that happened during war in it. So Tolstoy was able to draw on his own experiences of conflict because he was a soldier during the Crimean War and fought at the siege of Sevastopol. So there's a great deal of understanding and of military affairs in it as well. And most of all, there is this, as I say, Tolstoy was quite a sort of leisured aristocrat, so he had time to contemplate the purpose of his existence and so on. So there's a lot of deep thinking, especially in the character of Pierre Bezukhov, seeking a kind of a role in society and a purpose, to his life and so on, and that all comes out in the novel. So in terms of truth, the historical truth is being kind of seen through the lens of Tolstoy's period. The kind of violation of Russia's sovereignty by Napoleon's attack on that is obviously felt very deeply in War and Peace. And it's sort of so it runs against all of Tolstoy's emotions, that his country could be violated in that way. So there's kind of an interpretation of the truth in the novel. Now, when it comes to film and TV adaptations, there are sort of two, or even maybe even three permutations of that truth again. The first one is how true to the novel is the film adaptation. So how accurately does it mirror the book? Now, that again is going to be altered because whenever the film adaptation is made, there has obviously been a shift in time, and the historical perspective of the time in which the film is made is going to differ from the historical perspective when the book was written, from the actual history of the events themselves. So you've got that constant debate and discussion about the historical period going on not only at the time of the writing of the book, but at the time of the making of the film, whenever that was. So you've got how accurate is it to the book? How reflective is it of the time in which the film is made? But you've also then got how can you adapt the book in order for it to fit into the time you have available, for the length of the film or the TV series. So there will inevitably be an editing of the plot in order to sort of fit it into the time available. And when you're talking about a book that is that thick, clearly that is going to be, the longer the book, the greater the difficulty the screenwriter is going to have. So let's take all these different adaptations one at a time then and talk about them. So can't remember exactly. This is certainly 1950s Hollywood version. Think it was 1956. I have to pass on that. Certainly in the 1950s. All the kind of, well, not all of them, but lots of big Hollywood names. Audrey Hepburn plays Natasha Rostova. Henry Fonda plays Pierre Bezukhov. Mel Ferrer is Andrei Bolkonsky. So just from that sort of glamour, you can get an idea of how already you're getting a new perspective on the story. What this film did was actually take out all of the kind of romantic elements of War and Peace and turn them into a movie. Now, so that is another kind of key word that I think you need to take into account when you're looking at this triangle. It's the audience. So I've already, in a way, talked about the audience because the audience, in terms of Tolstoy writing War and Peace, is he had to attune himself to his readers' attitudes at the time, and they would have shared his horror at Napoleon's invasion if certainly his Russian readers would have done. Historians have to write in terms of their audience, which is partly fellow historians, but it's also partly to do with the nations in which they're writing. So, as I've said already, nationalists in Poland or in Belgium or in Greece in the 19th century would have lapped up histories of their own countries. Anyway, so when you're talking about the audience for this film, however, you're now talking about affluent, Western society in the 1950s. Not really. Cinema goers by this time aren't particularly going to go to the cinema to get a lecture in history or even to get a lecture in literature. They're going for escapism. They're going to see romance and spectacle and not really sort of the same audience as you'll get for the book or for history. So there are lots of changes made, lots of cuts in this film. Unless you know the book, you're going to be quite bewildered by the sudden leaps and jumps, where lots of characters have been cut out, lots of episodes have been removed, and what's left has all been stitched together. Just to sort of really tell the love story. These two principal characters who are in love with Natasha. It turns into a sort of not terribly good film because the plot is so jumpy, but also a far less profound work than War and Peace because of this emphasis on the love affair. At the time of the film, I think Henry Fonda was in his 40s, and Pierre Bezukhov, was in his sort of 20s in the novel. So there's a big age difference between Henry Fonda and the character of Pierre Bezukhov, which they had to get around. So that's one example of how the film isn't accurate to the book. So that it isn't sort of true to the book. Another example would be, for instance, that Bolkonsky. I'm going to give away lots of spoilers in this video. I should have warned you at the beginning. So if you haven't, if you intend to read the book or whatever, and you haven't done already, I'm going to be giving a lot away. But Bolkonsky is mortally wounded at the Battle of Borodino, and he does survive for some weeks, and that part of the plot revolves around his being reunited with Natasha at the end of his life. But Bezukov is actually present, even though he's not in the army. He's actually present at the Battle of Borodino as an observer of it, really. It's a sort of literary device that Tolstoy uses in order to be able to describe the battle in the book. But Bolkonsky ends up in a dressing station next to his not exactly enemy, but his sort of rival for Natasha's affections, a chap called Anatol Kuragin, and the Kuragin family feature very heavily in the book, but not so much in this film. Their sort of corrupt nature of the whole family and their machinations in order to rise through society and so on, and gain wealth and gain status. But Kuragin seduces Natasha. Anatol Kuragin seduces Natasha, but he ends up losing his leg at the Battle of Borodino, and he's lying on a table next to Bolkonsky, and the two of them are kind of reconciled in a way in their final hours in their agony. But in this film, that scene is removed, and instead they show, for some reason, they show the dressing station. There isn't really any need for them to do it, but what they do is they have Bezukov, who is actually present at the battle, as I say, carrying a wounded soldier to the dressing station, and when he gets there, he puts the wounded soldier down on the ground, and a medical orderly examines the wounded soldier and says to Bezukov, "You could have saved you could have spared yourself the effort. He's dead." And Bezukov is kind of surprised and saying, "Oh, no, that's not possible." And that, weirdly, is a scene that's lifted straight from All Quiet on the Western Front. So there's going to be a lot of connections between these three books, but that is a really strange one. And they've clearly taken that because it's such a sort of famous anti-war book and an anti-war movie. There had already been the 1930 adaptation of All Quiet on the Western Front out, and people would have been familiar with it. They've taken that and placed it into War and Peace, almost as a way of making an anti-war statement, which Tolstoy isn't actually making. So anyway, that's enough on that film. So this film had a direct effect on the making of this film as well, because this is Hollywood. This is the Soviet Russia version of War and Peace, which I think they started filming it in 1961, so it's kind of almost immediately after this had been released. And obviously in the 1950s and 1960s, height of the Cold War, um, the Soviets really had their national self-esteem almost insulted by the fact that it had been the Americans who had come out with this sort of attempt to adapt to film one of Russia's most famous novels. So the Soviets couldn't stand by and let that happen. So this started filming in 1961. I think it was finally released in 1969. It's very obvious that it took a long time to film because you can see the characters aging more quickly than they possibly would have done in the book. Although, when having said that, the story of War and Peace begins in 1805 and effectively ends in 1815, but well, in 1812 maybe you could say. But there's a sort of epilogue that's set in the 1820s. So the characters are aging in the film in the story, so that would match up to a way. But anyway, you can see a change in the an aging effect in the film, which you wouldn't normally do because films don't normally take that long to produce. So the Soviet era, obviously, history is seen in Russia in the Soviet period in a completely through the lens of communist ideology. So there is a complete, almost sort of either a rewriting or a censorship of historical writing. This is another key word, really. Not only truth and not only audience, but you have censorship going on in all of these three corners of the triangle. Censorship can either be passive, it can be the audience demanding, or the producer of the film or the writer of the book needing to appeal to the audience so that they're going to appeal to their tastes and their perspectives. So you have a kind of passive censorship, but you also have an active censorship where sort of in the Hollywood industry, for instance, would have very different standards on things, things like the portrayal of the romantic scenes or the portrayal of the violence. So that's one thing, but you also have state censorship where you can't say anything that goes against, especially in a totalitarian regimes that go against the sort of diktats of the regime that's in power at the time. So this film has a lot of, it has some advantages because they threw so much money at the making of this film. There are four parts to the film. The whole thing is about 7 hours long, so you've got far more room to place a lot of the plot into the film. But what they did with that time was, in fact, to use their enormous resources. They used massive numbers of real Soviet soldiers dressed up in Napoleonic uniforms. So the battle scenes, are still to this day really dramatic, really, sort of overlong, certainly overlong. And they take up, I think the Borodino scene alone must be easily approaching an hour of footage of, sort of horses thundering along and cannons firing and all this kind of thing. So, but what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, so they're, what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, so they're, what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, so they're, what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, so they're, what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, so they're, what they're doing, in fact, is, they're, removing a lot of the what they would have regarded as the contentious material in War and Peace, still retaining the romantic elements of it, replacing a lot of the contentious stuff with battle scenes and things. But they have this sort of additional problem that there are a lot of characters in War and Peace who who would have who were basically removed from society by this Bolshevik Revolution. So you have characters like Natasha's brother Nikolai, who has a very kind of domineering attitude towards the peasantry, for instance. You can't even have that portrayed in the Soviet version, because it's just anathema to them. So a lot of the social, shall we say, depictions of the time just simply aren't shown because they're so abhorrent to the Soviets. The class divide, the sort of justification of cruelty towards the peasants, suppression of them at one point. Natasha's brother rescues Bolkonsky's sister from a kind of peasant rebellion, you could almost say. Her serfs refuse to obey her commands and so on, and she's in jeopardy. And Natasha's brother Nikolai turns up just in time to save the day and whisk her away and rescue her, and there's a romance then that begins between them. But that's all cut out. It's all cut out of this film. So there is kind of both an active and a passive censorship going on in this particular film, as there is in this one, but for different reasons. This one for political reasons, this one for moral standards, basically. I might have to come back to this in a moment because there's something else I wanted to say about this. Oh yeah, I think it's basically to introduce this this notion of technology and what the camera is capable of doing, which is changing the whole time, and at the same time that is changing the audience's anticipation of what the film is going to give to them. So as time is going on, it's getting much easier to film outdoors and to film large battle scenes and so on. So the technology is kind of giving the audience that. So yeah, that's what the strength is kind of this film is the sort of epic scale of it. What's put in front of your face. Oh yeah, but they've got a sort of slight problem with Tolstoy was a liberal thinker, but by the time of the extremes of the Bolshevik Revolution, the liberal kind of thinking attitude of many of the much of imperial Russian society has been kind of dismissed by the Bolsheviks. That they had their chance, they blew it. So the Bolsheviks came along, effectively, is the sort of thought of the time, and swept away all the rotten and corrupt institutions of imperial Russia. So that they have to present Tolstoy's liberal thoughts without sympathizing with Tolstoy's kind of aristocratic privileges, which, and as I think I said earlier, Tolstoy and Bazukov are kind of very, you can identify a lot of Tolstoy's character in the character of Bazukov, so they have to be very careful about how they portray Bazukov in this film. Oh yeah, and by the way, there are further links between these two films, because Bazukov was played by the director of the film, Sergei Bondarchuk. This film was produced by Dino De Laurentiis, the Hollywood one. Obviously, the Soviets were watching the Americans were watching the Soviets, and Dino De Laurentiis was impressed by the production values of this film, and Sergei Bondarchuk came to the West at Dino De Laurentiis's instigation, and together they produced a film which many kind of military history enthusiasts will be very familiar with, Waterloo, starring Rod Steiger. And when you watch all three of these films, the two War and Peaces and Waterloo, you can see a lot of an amalgam of the two. The camera work, the way Bondarchuk used overhead rails to move cameras over terrain and film that way, not just battle scenes, but in War and Peace he flies over, beautiful shots of him of the camera flying over countryside and so on, very reminiscent of modern day drone footage in a way, and you can see a lot of the of Dino De Laurentiis and sort of Hollywood in the Waterloo as well. In particular, the soundtrack, the playing of the sort of renditions of the French, the Marseillaise and so on, but in a very kind of dirge-like rendition of it when he's showing menacing French armies in War and Peace, but also in the film Waterloo. Anyway, that's sort of off the track a little bit. So let's go on now. So this is 1956. This is about 1969. 3 years after that, 1972, the BBC brought out a TV serialisation of War and Peace. Can't remember exactly how many episodes there are in this. I think it's something like 24. Yeah, I won't go into it. There's a lot. So each one an hour long. So you're talking about 24 hours of TV. So obviously there is a lot more opportunity to fit the book into this TV serialization, and that's exactly what they do. They do have a really kind of good attempt at expressing a lot of the philosophy in the book as well. In this, it comes through in terms of conversations between various characters, discussing various sort of philosophical and metaphysical questions and so on, especially conversations between Bazukov, which is played by Anthony Hopkins in this version, and Bolkonsky. And they also do it by voicing inner thoughts. So there'll be a close-up on the face of the character who is having the thought, and then they will verbalise the thought so that the viewer can hear what's going on in the character's mind as well. So to my mind, I think this is the best ever and true to the book of adaptation of the book. I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me in that respect. In terms of the objective accuracy to history, lots of details that you could pick up saying, oh, they've got that uniform wrong, or that just doesn't look right, and so on. But remember, this goes back to the whole thing about technology, that in the early 1970s, there was still a very limited amount that TV could do outside of the studio. So a lot is filmed in TV studios. There are outdoor sequences, as you can see, but everything was far more difficult in those days. Cameras were very bulky. Uh, just the whole kind of technical challenge of filming an epic, which the Soviets didn't experience, is far more. The resources and the technology is has to be overcome for this BBC edition. Most telly certainly in the 1960s, but definitely in the early, maybe even up to the late 1970s in the UK, certainly it was very much like watching a theatre performance. So the camera was almost like on stage rather than being outdoors. So you do get a feel of it being almost like you're watching a stage play rather than you're watching a film, a cinema film, that is. So again, you've got technology coming in and what the audience can expect. The other thing, of course, in the 1970s, when this was made, there were only there was certainly only the BBC and ITV. I think BBC Two was certainly around by 1972, but there very little choice for the TV audience. So the BBC could afford to have a very prolonged series. They had the resources, they had the money, to put on a long TV series, and if the audience didn't really like it, they didn't have much option what else they were going to watch on telly. So this is very kind of, it's aimed at an audience that has a knowledge of the book. It's aimed at an audience that wants to be challenged in a way, to be made to think about the same issues that Tolstoy, wanted to present to his audience. And that's why I like it, really. That's why I think it's such a good version. But it wouldn't satisfy. It couldn't be done nowadays. It wouldn't be done nowadays. And in fact, let's get on to the next. So the BBC once again brought out a version. Again, I've forgotten the date, but it's not that long ago. Something like 2016, 2017, very recent. But they had another go at doing the same thing, and time, even in the sort of 30, 40 years that have gone by, you can see the difference in the way the BBC have gone about it. For a start, it's only 6 episodes, I think, so it's a quarter of the length of this one, so they have far less time in which to get across to the audience the content of this book. They have far less audience loyalty because there are so many channels on the television now, that, as I say, if they get over conformist to the book, viewers are just going to switch off. So they have to go back to this this version in a way, and have the romance. So it's interesting that you've got the same 3 characters portrayed in the same order here. Bazukov, who was played by Paul Dano, Natasha Vostova, and Andrei Bolkonsky, So they've got this sort of, it's almost like a love triangle. It wasn't quite as, unsubtle as that, but yeah, this certainly they do concentrate on this, the romance of the book, whereas Tolstoy is really placing his characters in this sort of, he's placing this romance against the backdrop of momentous events, and it's really to show, it's to add to the intensity of the emotions really in the book. That's the reason he sets it during the, or one of the reasons why he sets it during the Napoleonic Wars and not during his own time. But so you have got this emphasis on the visual appeal of the film, the settings. The cameras can get outside a lot more. So the quality of the film, the cinematic effects, and so on. On the small screen, are much improved, and it's a sort of lovely. It's very good. It's a very good, series to watch. It's a lovely, visually kind of attractive and compelling story, but the more philosophic, and profound elements of the book are given sort of a very sort of low profile in this. So it's become, it's the audience, going back to this passive censorship. It's the audience really determining, sort of what's in the film. So it's a sort of passive censorship. And of course now the BBC, far more financially challenged. So even though, they're essentially subsidised by the TV license fee, they still have to think about audiences and share of audience and so on, and marketing the DVDs and whatever after this TV version is, excuse me, sorry, after the TV version has been on. So there's far more kind of commercial minded mindset in the BBC nowadays, and all that comes across in the production of this film, which I think they can say, was a success. But it's not, to my mind, it's not as true to the book as their original BBC series. So I'm going to stop on War and Peace at the moment, and go on to my second book that I want to talk about. This has gone on for quite a long time already, and this will be a long video, I'm afraid. But I'm going to come back to a lot of the things I've discussed and refer back to War and Peace as I move on, just as I referred forward to All Quiet on the Western Front when I was talking about that scene in War and Peace. So let's change things around. Right, I'm going to move on to Dr. Zhivago next. There are a lot of parallels with Dr. Zhivago to War and Peace, and a lot of connections. I've got the same triangle set up here. So you have the history of the period, you have the historical novel, and then you have a film and a TV adaptation of that historical novel. So to begin with then, Boris Pasternak, the author of Dr. Zhivago, was essentially a poet from a well-to-do family. His father was a noted painter of his time, and his mother was a pianist, I believe. They had a lot of social connections, were quite affluent. So again, Pasternak is similar to Tolstoy in that he doesn't have any pressing need, sort of survival well, not at least in his at his birth. His comes from quite a privileged background, is what I'm trying to say. Um, Also, his parents were acquainted with Tolstoy, so there was a link there. Tolstoy visited the Pasternak home when Boris Pasternak was a boy, so the two would have met, although the extreme difference in age, obviously. So there's a sort of connection there as well, and I feel that Pasternak is a sort of a natural successor to Tolstoy in a way, even though he didn't write that many novels. He was mainly writing poetry. Um, Dr. Zhivago has some similar kind of themes to War and Peace. In particular, it's set against a backdrop of momentous historic events. Unlike Tolstoy's War and Peace, though, Pasternak actually lived through those times, didn't necessarily participate in them, to the extent that the character Dr. Zhivago does, but he lived through the times. Pasternak lived through the times, and there is a lot of similarities between the central character of the book, Dr. Zhivago, and with Pasternak himself in exactly the same way that there are similarities between Pierre Bezukhov and Tolstoy in War and Peace. And also, Pasternak has got this real sense in the book, and it comes through particularly in the Hollywood version of Dr. Zhivago as well, for a sort of reverence for the beauty of nature and the sort of there's lots of sky gazing as well. Stalin famously described Boris Pasternak as a cloud dweller. But there is a lot of appreciation of the beauties of nature and the sort of inward drive that creates to look at to sort of examine the meaning of life in that way. So it has a lot of similarities in that respect to War and Peace. In terms of the history, though, as I say, Pasternak actually lived through the period of history that is portrayed in the novel. But the history, if Napoleon was contentious, then the sort of the interpretations of Napoleon's career and the narrative about the Napoleonic period, has been discussed and debated. I mean, that is nothing to the debate that has gone on over the period of the Russian Civil War and the Russian Revolution and so on. And this comes back again to the whole thing about censorship, both passive and active. The Soviet regime rewrote history, really. They sort of, as I was trying to explain with their attitude towards War and Peace, their portrayal of the revolution, in particular, is very much railroaded down the lines of a communist interpretation of historical events. The communists had a big problem when explaining why the revolution happened and how it happened, in that Marxist ideology really sort of presented really presented the history as a science, as something that could be examined and explained, and then also projected forwards as sort of scientific, very objective kind of mechanism. So Marx and Engels didn't expect a revolution, a communist revolution, to begin in a place like Russia. They thought that the class divide that came out of the Industrial Revolution, so the evolution of capitalists on one side and the proletariat on the other, would result in a clash of those two divisions of society. So it would have to occur, the communist revolution would have to occur, first of all, in a society that was heavily industrialized. And Russia, as I was saying, over the sort of mid-19th century crisis at the time of the Tsar Alexander II, Russia was way behind in terms of industrialization and in terms of the evolution of a proletariat. So the revolution as it happened in Russia was kind of impure, almost, as far as communist ideology went, and the historians had to be very careful about how they how they sort of wrote about it and so on, in order to justify the revolution happening and Russia taking the lead in this sort of the communist revolution, the Bolshevik revolution that happened in Russia, that would hopefully spread to the rest of the world. And then, of course, you've also got the clashes that happened after the revolution took place, very definitely between Stalin and Trotsky, with Stalin coming to the fore as the Soviet leader after Lenin's death, and Trotsky was driven into exile and finally assassinated in Mexico in the 1940s at Stalin's behest. Some things never change, but Trotsky's version of what happened during the revolution wouldn't have been accepted within Soviet Russia. So you have a controversy in that respect as well. And Pasternak, obviously, not only lived through this period of history, but is then writing Dr. Zhivago at the height of Stalin's dictatorship. So whereas a lot of novelists and so on, well, a lot of poets, as he was originally, had to take care in what they expressed. Pasternak very definitely didn't. He was concerned with that core word that I was talking about, the truth, and wrote his poetry and wrote Dr. Zhivago with absolutely no concern for his own personal safety. I'll get on again a little bit later to the safety of his loved ones, though, which does become a factor. But he was primarily concerned with writing the truth as he saw it, regardless of whether it fitted into the Soviet ideal or whether it overtly or secretly, silently criticised the communist state for any reason in particular. So Pasternak was in quite a unique position to be able to do that. and it's a really weird fluke of history that was so. A poet that he was contemporary with and admired, who is mentioned in Dr. Zhivago, the book, and he's also mentioned in for strange reasons in this TV adaptation of Dr. Zhivago, was Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky fell foul of the Soviet authorities and possibly was killed, certainly died, I think in 1930. He was shot through the heart. Whether he committed suicide or was assassinated is unclear to this day. Another fellow poet was Mandelstam, who died in captivity. He was arrested a couple of times, but sentenced to internal exile and died in a transit camp on his way to somewhere like Siberia. But Pasternak continued writing poetry and continued, although it was in a similar vein to Mayakovsky's and Mandelstam's, and he was careless about what he wrote. Well, not careless. He was careless about what the authorities would do to him. For some reason, he got into a really unique and personal relationship with Stalin. At one time, he'd actually been interviewed by Trotsky. He'd been questioned and interviewed by Trotsky. That comes out in the book, in the scene where Zhivago is questioned by the character Strelnikov. So there are echoes of Pasternak's encounter with Trotsky in that scene. But in particular with Stalin, Stalin's wife committed suicide in 1932, I think. And her main reason for doing so was her remorse at Stalin's infidelity. Now, Pasternak was certainly of not very strong moral fibre. It's not quite the right phrase, but he was a serial kind of adulterer. He was married twice. He had two wives, but during both of these marriages, he took lovers and so on. He easily fell, to romance. He was a great romantic, as I say, not only a romantic in terms of his love of nature, but also in terms of his passion for women. But when Stalin's wife committed suicide in 1932, Pasternak, who was clearly on the Soviets' radar for his slightly seditious sort of poetry, wrote a very personal letter to Stalin, expressing his remorse and his understanding of the situation, because they were both unfaithful to their wives. And that really touched, a core with Stalin. So Stalin, from that point on, always protected, because Stalin was so personally connected with the death lists and the administration of his terror, and took a very kind of hands-on control of it, direct responsibility for the purges and for the list of arrests and exiles and executions and so on. He from then on, he became Pasternak's guardian angel. So Pasternak had, protection from the very top, from the highest authorities, and the secret police would often, sort of report to Stalin on Pasternak's behaviour and so on, but it never got to the point where Pasternak himself was arrested. Much of his family had left Russia in the very early stages of the sort of communist regime. I think it was still while Lenin was alive. It was in the early 1920s. They had left, eventually settled in Oxford in England. But Pasternak himself stayed. So the Soviets didn't really have much kind of capital, hostages that they could threaten instead of Zhivago, instead of Pasternak, until Pasternak actually took a mistress that who he fell deeply in love with, in I think it was 1946, and that was a woman who Lara is drawn from in the novel Dr. Zhivago. So you can see kind of parallels with Tolstoy in terms of putting his own character into Pierre Bezukhov, and Pasternak doing that with Dr. Zhivago. But also Pasternak goes beyond that in that he puts other people that he knows into the novel, such as his mistress Olga becomes Lara in the book. And when that happened, the Soviet, Stalin in particular, or the secret police and whatever, had someone that they could get to in order to get to Pasternak. So Olga, his mistress, was imprisoned for a time, had a miscarriage, unfortunately, while she was undergoing interrogation and, treat her bad treatment in the Lubyanka prison, the prison of the KGB in Moscow, was only released after Stalin's death, when there was a brief thawing of the terror at the end of Stalin's death and at the beginning of Khrushchev's presidency, premiership, whatever he was. So that didn't stop Pasternak writing Dr. Zhivago. He began writing it. It took about 20 years for him to write Dr. Zhivago. He started it in 1934. There was a kind of brief hiatus really during the Second World War, when he was he worked as a fire warden in St. Petersburg, was it? Or Moscow? Probably Moscow, because he lived in a kind of Soviet-style commune almost outside of Moscow, where the regime could keep an eye on all these various writers and authors and novelists and poets and so on, artists in general. So that's where Pasternak was placed, and he was perfectly happy living there. It's a very comfortable existence, and the authorities could keep an eye on them all. But it didn't stop Pasternak continuing to write what he wanted to write. But he began, as I say, began it in 1934, only finally got it into script in around 1954, and that was, a lot of that was with Olga's help, his mistress's help, and then found that he couldn't get it published. Originally, he thought his publisher, who published his poems, would publish it, but clearly there was an intervention from the authorities, and couldn't get it published. So what happened then was that there was a communist leaning Italian publishers who had a representative in Moscow. He got wind of the fact that there was this script of this book that was known to be, very kind of. It was going to be a bestseller if it ever got published. He knew it was going to be a success, but the Soviets were keeping a lid on it. So he was able to contact Pasternak and smuggle it out of Russia. There were various other copies that were smuggled through other sources, including the Vatican. The Roman Catholic Church at one point had a role to play in getting documents smuggled out. But the main one was this, I think it was called Fratrinelli, something like that, Italian publisher, still exists today, who got the rights to publish Dr. Zhivago outside of Russia. This is around 1956, I think, and also translate it into a lot of other languages and get it translated in English and French and Italian and all kinds of languages. And it was an instant bestseller, but not really known inside Soviet Russia. So it was known that Pasternak had written this book, but not the actual reading of it wasn't possible. It was only finally published in Russia in 1988. Where am I going with this now? So that really infuriated Khrushchev. It wasn't so much the content of the book; it was the fact that Pasternak had circumvented the Soviet censorship and got it published anyway. So it became a remarkable kind of weapon in the sort of Cold War, in the sort of culture war, as it were, between the Americans and the Russians. And the CIA in particular, I said earlier about the Vatican leaking the book out, but I think it might have been the Vatican leaking the book back in, the translation back in to Russia, that they took a role in. So the CIA went to great lengths to smuggle and infiltrate the book back into Russia so that it could be read by Russian readers. And they did that with no regard really to Pasternak's personal safety. But as I said, certainly his loved ones did suffer as a result of that. Pasternak never profited from the financial success of the book. And also he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature and was forbidden from accepting it by the Soviet authorities. So for a long time he was listed as having refused the medal, but it was done under duress. He didn't profit from the work. He was aware of the adulation, but couldn't trumpet that in any way. And he died late 50s, I think. I'm not sure. But anyway, that's the sort of story of how the book was released. So very much, as I was saying, you have to look at the historical novel from the perspective of the time and the circumstances in which it's written. And in the case of Pasternak, he is a really sort of worthy winner of the Nobel Prize because he overcame and ignored the pressures that were on him, which other authors don't do or don't see the need to do. But anyway, we go on from the book, and you can see that my particular version of the book, I must have purchased this in the days of pre-decimisation, because it cost me some shillings and sixpence. But this has got on its front cover an image from the film, which was made 1962, 63, something like that. So is the film true to the book? I don't think it is. Is it kind of a reflection of the time when the film was made? Yes, very much so. But the film concentrates on the love affair. You can even see it in this kind of portrayal of Zhivago and Lara, sort of in a sort of loving moment together. The film is a fantastic film, but principally a portrayal of all the momentous events, the revolution, the pre-revolutionary kind of suppressions, life in Russia, the war, the Civil War, the First World War, the Civil War, all set against a backdrop of momentous events and stupendous scenery, expressing the Pasternak's admiration of nature and so on. But it's mainly a love story. So it's not true to the book, but it kind of became a work of art in its own right, I would say. So most people won't have read Dr. Zhivago, who have seen this film. So they will only be familiar with the story, the plot, as presented in the film of Dr. Zhivago. There is far more to the book than that. There is as much. There's poetry in here. They've got a list of all of Dr. Zhivago's supposed poetry in the back of the book, but actually written by the poet Boris Pasternak. None of that comes across. None of the kind of political thinking comes across, because Pasternak was a liberal, just like Tolstoy was a liberal. He did sympathise with the aims of the revolution. He did see, the corrupt and evil sort of nature of the pre-revolutionary Russia. And that's probably why he was so disillusioned with what came out of the revolution in terms of the terror, the Soviet terror and so on. He really despised the Soviet regime, but Pasternak had a great love for his country, which is why he chose not to leave with his parents in the early 1920s. And he had a great sort of love of the Russian people, the Russian country, the need for sort of beauty in the world, and the need for progress and so on. But most of that doesn't come out in the film. The film is really aimed, again, audience comes into it, it's aimed at putting bums on seats, and it certainly did that. I can remember seeing this film when it first came out, when it was released in early 1960s as a boy, and it really, sort of influenced my my world outlook, almost, you could say. It really it was a really thrilling, moving kind of film, but doesn't have half of the the depth of the book, which I did read. It must have been fairly soon after if I bought it pre-decimal, but I've reread it. But anyway, that takes me on to this TV adaptation. And again, can't remember exactly when this came out. I think it was around 2006. Hans Matheson plays Zhivago and Keira Knightley plays Lara. 6 parts, so we're already, in that period when ITV, in this case, it was an ITV production, are having to sort of trim down, edit down the story in order to fit it into the time available and the resources available. But I would say this is a good series. It is, don't get me wrong. I watched it at the time, bought this DVD recently so that I could watch it again for the purposes of this video, and enjoyed watching it again. It has a little bit more nuance in it than this one does, in terms of, as I said, it mentions Mayakovsky in it and so on. There are references, to Mayakovsky in it, which it left out of the film completely. But I would say this TV version owes more to the film than it does to the book. So it is a kind of romantic, it's a romance set against important historical events, rather than rather than a kind of an expression of Russian, rather than an expression of the Russian character and the sort of the things that Pasternak was trying to say. It's simply reiterating the sort of the romance of the film. And to give you an example of that, probably not many of you would have seen or remember this TV version, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen the film Dr. Zhivago. So close to the end of the story, Zhivago dies. Now, in the film, he is on a tram. I think it must be in the 1930s, Moscow, travelling along on a tram, and he, out of the window, he sees Lara. He sees who he has been, separated from for many years by that stage. So he sees Lara out of the window, and he tries to open the tram window and can't, and he's in failing health. He's got a dicky heart, and he strains himself trying to open the window, and then in his desperation leaves the tram and runs after Lara and has a heart attack in the street and falls down dead, and Lara's completely oblivious to the fact that he's calling her and chasing after her, so she just walks off, and that's how he dies. In this, the very similar kind of death portrayed in this TV version, except that Zhivago is sitting at a cafe, and out of the window of the cafe he sees a boy come up to the window, and the boy has a very kind of familiar look to him, because the boy is played by the same actor that plays Zhivago as a boy in the film. So it's obviously, the viewer can recognise immediately that this boy at the window is Zhivago's son by Lara. And sure enough, as he watches this boy walk down the pavement, he joins up with his mother and he recognises Lara, and he dashes to go, out to sort of find her, and falls down dead in the cafe. So a similar kind of tragic romantic ending to both of the characters in the film and in the TV version. Now, in the book, for one thing, the actual character of Dr. Zhivago was married again. So he's married first of all to Tonya, who's played by Geraldine Chaplin in the film. Then he has an affair with Lara that coincides at the same time. So there's this whole portrayal of inevitable, love inevitably leading the male character down the road of infidelity. But in the book, Zhivago is married for a second time. So there's a third woman who doesn't really have a very high profile in the story, but you have to note that he was married a second time, just as Boris Pasternak was married a second time. And actually, Olga, his Pasternak's mistress, Pasternak only met when he was quite an elderly man. He must have been in his, I'm guessing in his 50s. So there's something like a 25 year age gap between Pasternak and Olga, which there isn't between Zhivago and Lara. They're the same age, and their affair takes place at the time of Zhivago's first marriage to Tonya. But anyway, so there's that sort of diminution of the romantic side of the story in that Pasternak marries again, but also his actual death takes place on a tram, so it's similar to the film in that respect, only and he is suffering from, he is about to die imminently anyway because he has such an unhealthy heart, but he's sitting on a tram and it's a hot day and the tram is packed, crowded, and it keeps getting stopped as it's moving along the track. So, it's inevitably going to cause the character of Zhivago a certain amount of distress, on his heart, just from these appalling kind of conditions. Commuters on the London Underground will probably be familiar with the sensation. So Zhivago in the book attempts to get the window open. So again, it's following the same similar kind of story to this. Oh no! Before he attempts to get the window open, he's idly looking out of the window, and he's kind of he's just sort of musing on the notion of people passing along on the pavement who are walking at a slower speed than the tram when it's actually travelling, but then because the tram keeps having to stop, the people on the sidewalk on the pavement overtake the tram again, and he starts to kind of almost have this sort of philosophical kind of contemplation on that being the nature of life in general, that people tend to have parallel existences but move at different speeds. So there are times when their lives overlap and other times when one or the other will go ahead or fall behind. And that's very much in the nature of the story of Zhivago. It's about all these important and historic events and personal events as well taking place. But some people kind of, the characters kind of thread their way in and out of these events, sometimes sharing the same experiences and sometimes experiencing different things at the same, in different places So their lives intertwine, but don't necessarily, sort of run in parallel and synchronize completely throughout their lives. So Zhivago is kind of thinking about this, and then he gets very uncomfortable, and he attempts to open the window, and can't get it open because it's been nailed shut. So he realizes that he's done himself an injury. He can feel the stress on his heart muscle, and thinks that he's probably at that point thinks he's probably about to have a heart attack. So he struggles to get off of this crowded tram and finds that as difficult as trying to open the window. Finally gets out onto the pavement and then has a heart attack and dies. So he doesn't actually see Lara out of the tram window or the cafe window. He's just desperately trying to get off of, to get the window open to get some air, or to get off the tram to try and get more comfortable when he dies. But he has had this idea of watching people. He has been watching people out of the window. And as it happens, one of the people that he was watching is an elderly lady, I think in a violet dress or something, but he remarks on her just as one of these, markers, as it were, of the speed of the tram, that sometimes she's ahead of the tram, sometimes she's falling behind. So that's the only kind of reference to a personality outside of the window. But as it happens, the woman is a character in the story, a very minor character called Mademoiselle Fleury, who was a servant in a hospital that Zhivago worked at during the First World War. So the two characters did have an overlap of their existences in exactly the way that that Zhivago is imagining, in terms of the trains. But it's completely lost on Zhivago. He doesn't recognise the character Mademoiselle Fleury at all. And also, Mademoiselle Fleury, it says, is in Moscow to get her visa to leave the country. She's French by birth, and she's finally got permission to return to France. And she's completely oblivious to the fact that there's even been... I think she may notice that a man has collapsed in the street, but she's completely oblivious to the fact that he is someone that she once met in her life in this hospital in the First World War. So it's complete, this was added partly for romantic effect. It has a very strong romantic appeal to it, but also in terms of the need for a film or a TV adaptation to pare down the content of the book to the relevance to the story that they're trying to say, but also not really being able to express that inner contemplation on the screen in a visual way and without dialogue. So it's something that they both directors rather, chose to cut out and alter. And as I said earlier, the film, the TV, follows the film in quite a lot of ways, but that is one way in which they sort of aped the film rather than aping the book. So now let's get on to the final book, All Quiet on the Western Front. Right then, so same again, we have this triangle. There's history of the period, there's the historical novel, and there are the, in this case, all film adaptations, although I suppose you might describe this centre version of All Quiet on the Western Front as a TV version, possibly It sort of overlapped. It was produced by Carlton, who were an ITV company, so I suppose it was a made-for-TV film. I don't think it got any exposure in cinemas in particular. So we'll start with the history then. Very difficult and contentious subject then, the history of the First World War. Not only its causes, but the way events have been re-evaluated over the years. So I've put these two books here just as an example. A.J.P. Taylor's history of the First World War, written very much from the perspective of an anti-war and liberal thinking historian, fantastic historian. Always admired A.J.P. Taylor, but you have, as I say, historians have to write from a particular perspective, and that's what A.J.P. Taylor did as much as anyone else who had a right to. This one, not particularly significant book in one respect. It's mainly illustrated pictures, but J.H.J. Anderson, I think, is a Dutch historian, is very much trying to redress the balance of how the First World War is described, to give the Germans a little bit more of a kind of favourable characterization. So things like his explanation of why the U-boat campaign was almost obliged to sink shipping without allowing the crews and passengers and civilians and so on to disembark first of all, and saying that it was virtually suicidal for U-boat captains to make that gesture, because on the surface they were vulnerable to gunfire, and so many ships, including shipping lines and so on, chose to arm their ships, and then of course you had the Q ships, which were deliberately disguised as vulnerable merchant ships in order to entice the submarines to the surface, and then they would their guns would be revealed, and they would then sink the U-boats. So basically, Andrews is saying they had little choice if they were to interrupt the Atlantic shipping routes and so on, but to do it very callously and to cause a great many unnecessary deaths. And he sort of points out the contrasting number of civilians in Germany, women and children. I think it's about 40,000. I'm not sure of the exact figures, but tens of thousands of innocent civilians died because of the British blockade of the German ports, North Sea ports. So it was a very similar kind of callous behaviour on both sides. Another one would be the whole reason that Britain supposedly entered the war, which was to protect Belgian neutrality. There were signatories to a pact in the 1830s when Belgium originally got its independence. That Belgium would remain a neutral country, and Germany infringed on that by the Schlieffen Plan and the armies moving through Belgium to get around the flank of the Allied armies. But Anderson points out that the British had actually weren't treating Belgium as a neutral country prior to the First World War, that they were trying to persuade them to come into a sort of secret alliance with the British and the French in case of a German in case of German aggression. So there's quite a few examples like that, and I won't go into it in too much detail. But the main problem that all historians have is the fact that the First and the Second World Wars were really the same war with a 20-year interval of peace in between. But of course, in that period, Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany, and the sort of moral balance very much shifted in favour of the Allies in the Second World War, because of the insidious nature of Nazism and Hitler's regime, and that has tended, as time has gone on, to colour our feelings about the German cause in the First World War. So you could argue that the Germans in the First World War had some very legitimate rights and concerns. They were a massively expanding industrial power, and saw themselves very much as a kind of parallel with the United States. German naval growth prior to the First World War was perfectly legitimate, but the British saw it as a threat. But to the Germans, the British Empire was as much of and the British naval power was as much of a constraint on their expansion as the Spanish Empire and the Spanish Navy had been on the expansion of the American, we call it empire, American expansion anyway, 20 years earlier, and the Americans had developed a modern fleet, destroyed the Spanish fleet in 1898, and then taken on a number of their overseas possessions, such as the Philippines. Germany didn't really have much of an empire, and what it did have, colonies abroad, what it did have was looked on with sort of dread by the British, who saw it as a challenge to their own empire, and they saw the German Navy as a challenge to their connections to India, for instance. But Germany equally could argue that they had as much right as the British to an empire, regardless of your opinions on imperialism, which A.J.P. Taylor was certainly, opposed to. The British and Germans had equal kind of moral justice on their side, if you like. It was only with the sort of sink into Nazism that Germany became, a sort of an evil, morally evil regime, and then history has sort of formed a different opinion of the First World War. So that brings me on to the novel then. So Eric Maria Remarque actually has similarities in a way to both Tolstoy and Pasternak, in that in this book, the character Paul Baumer is very much a reflection of Remarque's own character and experiences. Unlike Tolstoy and unlike Pasternak, Eric Maria Remarque not only lived through the time that he describes in the novel, but he actually took part in the events. Tolstoy wasn't alive at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Pasternak was alive at the time of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, but didn't participate in any of the conflicts. Whereas Eric Maria Remarque is purposely writing about his own experiences on the Western Front, whilst adopting it's not an autobiographical account by any means. It's really a very kind of impressionistic account of the Western Front, but using his own experiences to colour it. It's very episodic in nature, and there's no. Although there are times, there are years mentioned, and seasons of the year mentioned. There's no real chronology in it, and in fact, the actual chronology of the war doesn't even have a bearing on the development of the plot. So, for instance, the story begins with Paul Baumer and his classmates joining up. They're all sort of a group of school children joining up at the beginning of the war, and then it goes through to October 1918 when the final one of them, which is the Paul Baumer himself, who is the narrator of the story, is killed. Now, two things on that. It makes it as the book is sort of narrated by the character Paul Baumer, it makes it very difficult for the book to end. So there's a short paragraph at the end of the book where a different narrator, an unnamed narrator, describes Paul dying in October 1918. So that's a little bit of a tricky situation that the writer has to get himself out of. How do you kill off the narrator of a book? But the main thing is that events that actually happened in the Great War, for instance, of something that you would expect a German soldier who was on the Western Front in 1918 to comment on, would have been the massive German offensive of March 1918, which was really the turning point of the war, because it certainly broke the stalemate and the deadlock on the Western Front, and the Germans made massive intrusions into France and beyond the Allied lines. They broke through the Allied lines, but then the offensive ran out of steam, and the Germans were basically slowed down by not only exhaustion, but by their kind of exploitation of all the food and commodities and clothing and so on that they found in abundance in the rear of the Allied lines that they didn't enjoy the benefits of behind their own lines. So they basically stopped and ate and drank and acquired new boots and new clothing, all that kind of thing, and forgot about the actual aims of the offensive. And certainly any German soldier would have been a high point of their diary or their narration if they were talking about if they were trying to reference their own experiences to the events of the First World War. Remark doesn't do that at all. The 1918 passes, and it's the whole narrative is simply filled up with lots of separate episodes. Some things that happen that are fairly, violent and grisly. Other things that happen that are just tragic or sad. Some things that happen that are humorous. It's the book is really to give you an impression, or it's written to give you an impression of what life was like on the Western Front, rather than what actually would have happened. So it's kind of removed from historical reality in a way, but much closer, because Remarque actually experienced the war himself, much closer to reality in terms of what a soldier might have experienced. Now, the famous opening line of the paragraph of the book, which is certainly quoted at the beginning of these two films. I'm not sure, I don't think it's quoted at the beginning of this one, the latest version, but I want to talk a lot more about that in a moment. The book begins by Remarque writing, "This book is intended neither as an accusation nor as a confession, but simply as an attempt to give an account of a generation that was destroyed by the war, even those of it who survived the shelling." Now, most people have taken that opening remark as being an attempt on Remarque's part to explain the losses and the suffering and the trauma that an entire generation experienced. But this word generation, as you begin to read through the book and read through a lot of the conversations that the characters have with one another, and that Baumer narrates to the reader, you begin to realise that Remarque's meaning of a generation isn't of the entire body of people that fought in the German army, or indeed in any of the armies during the war. It's specifically of his age group. So it's specifically of those people who were close to the end of their schooling, 17 or 18 years old, who left to fight in the war, and didn't really have any sort of life to come back to, because they weren't mature enough to have got jobs, to have married, to have family. So they had very little to come back to after the war was over. So in other words, the trauma that was inflicted on them and the changes to their personalities and their mental state, those that survived, they came back to a society that they were alienated from because of their experiences that they couldn't really get across to their, the civilian population. But at the same time, they didn't have a life that they could go back to. So they were completely lost. They were a lost generation, whether or not they survived the war. And that's the point he's trying to make. So it's most definitely an anti-war novel, but not really in the way that people have interpreted it if they've only seen these films. You have to really read the book in order to understand his point. Now, as I said much earlier, I was quite surprised when I saw this film, the latest version, how different the story is from its two predecessors, and that was why I had to read the book in order to check which of these versions was the most accurate. But something that came out when I read this book is how much more there is in the book that doesn't appear in any of these films. As I say, it's made up of a whole montage of episodes that are linked kind of by the characters rather than by the turn of events. So it's linked by probably about 20 principal characters. But there are a lot more things happening in here than there are in any of the films. So to give you an example of that, Paul Baumer goes home on leave at one point in the book, and feels himself very alienated from his hometown and his family. Remarque himself didn't have a very good relationship with his father, but he certainly did with his mother, had a lot of affection for his mother. And that's kind of portrayed in the home leave episode in the book with Paul Baumer. But Paul Baumer finds he's kind of restless and wants to get back to he wants to get away from his family more than back to the front. He's feeling kind of isolated, so he cuts short his leave at home, but it's not the intention of his leave for him to go straight back to the front. In fact, what he's supposed to do is report to a local barracks in order to undertake some more training, and that's not present in any of these stories. In fact, the barracks is adjacent to a prisoner of war camp, housing Russian prisoners of war. And in the book, there's a sort of whole passages on the way the Russian prisoners were treated and his attitude to them, all that kind of thing. It just doesn't appear. So that is one example. Now, while I'm still on the book, rather than going to the DVDs straight away, just sort of talk a little bit about the censorship issue, because another thing that appears in this book is that it is a lot of very grisly events. So, for instance, there is a scene where they walk through an area where there are still some sort of trees remaining after a period of heavy shell fire, but the trees have hanging from some of the remaining branches parts of bodies and entire torsos and things like that. Really sort of gruesome sight, which is excluded from these first two DVDs, but interestingly, not from this one. They do have that scene. There are other scenes where a whole group of soldiers are gassed because they are inexperienced, and they take their gas masks off too soon, and they're lying in a sort of crater area where the gas settles. So that appears as a kind of very toned down event in this one, the middle one, where a single raw recruit, after a gas attack, tries to retrieve his dropped rifle from a shell hole and finds that there's still gas at the bottom where his rifle is, and he's killed that way. But not the sort of a vast number of people. In this film, there is a sort of an episode similar to that, where they discover the bodies of a whole new batch of reinforcements who have been gassed on their way to the front line. But they're in a sort of an industrial building where they've taken shelter and it's simply evident that they were gassed and weren't wearing their gas masks for long enough. They took them off too soon. But the point I'm trying to make is that in terms of censorship, some of those far more gruesome scenes couldn't be really shown because of censorship regulations. Certainly in the 1930 Hollywood version, they had to be kind of really tempered in this version, and only really are shown graphically in this latest version. So that's one aspect of censorship. The other aspect of censorship is the sort of state censorship of the type that Pasternak experienced when writing Dr. Zhivago, with the Soviet regime attempting to, suppress his book and so on, and the censorship that, and even the executions or deaths of some of his fellow poets and so on. In respect of All Quiet on the Western Front, Remarque wrote this. I think it was published in 1924, so it's quite a time. It's about another 9 years before the Nazis come into power in Germany. But the Nazis absolutely hated this book. They saw it as a betrayal of the soldiers, the German soldiers who did fight on the Western Front. They even went so far as to suggest that Remarque hadn't actually been on the Western Front. Other things as well that they objected to was that his name was originally spelt the German way, Remarque, with a K at the end. And because he was a descendant, because he was a descendant from French emigres who had left France during the time of the French Revolution, he reverted to his French spelling of his surname, and Maria was the name of his mother, so he added that to his name. Because, as I say, he did have a fond affection for his mother. But the Nazis took exception to that. They even suggested that he was actually Jewish because Remarque is Kramer spelt backwards. They came out with all kinds of things to try and besmirch his name. But he had left Germany before the Germans came to power. His book was so successful that he'd actually been able to afford to emigrate, and he went to Switzerland to begin with. Later on, about the time this film was released in 1930, he went to America. He was a friend of quite a number of glamorous women, including Marlene Dietrich, who got him the kind of introduction to Hollywood circles and so on. He ended his days married to Paulette Goddard, the Hollywood star. Died in Switzerland, I think in having to guess now. I think it was around the 1960 age, something like that. But anyway, he had left Germany by the time the Nazis came to power, but they did everything they could to suppress the book in Germany. It was one of many titles burnt by the Nazis, and in a very similar fashion to Pasternak, although Pasternak had this sort of get out of jail card, almost literally a get out of jail card free. But through his relationship with Stalin, Remarque would certainly have been executed or imprisoned in a concentration camp if he had still been living in Germany. But the Nazis couldn't get to him, so they got to his sister in a very similar way to how the Soviets got to Pasternak's mistress Olga and imprisoned her. The Nazis arrested Remarque's sister during the Second World War, accused her of, oh, I don't know what it was, like sort of an anti-war sentiment or something like that. But she was actually executed in 1943, beheaded by the Nazis, and it was simply done through pure hatred of Eric Maria Remarque rather than for any offence that his poor sister had made. So, in terms of censorship, the censorship was retrospective with All Quiet on the Western Front, but by that time, it was and still remains, a bestseller in outside of Germany. So I think that's everything on the terms of censorship. Now, and also in terms of the truth, because it wasn't accurate in terms of a portrayal of chronological events, but it was highly accurate in terms of the experience of being on the Western Front. So let's move on to the films themselves. So this one came out in 1930, black and white, and also maybe at this point a good place to sort of point out that in 1930 there wasn't really any private ownership of televisions. That only became, sort of prominent after the Second World War. So there's no way of making a TV adaptation of the book in 1930 because TV effectively didn't exist. It was still in its sort of prototype stages of development. So cinema had a far the audience was different in those days because the cinema was the only really visual medium that the general public could go to. So the audience is different. So the film is directed at that different audience. Obviously, it's subject to the sort of standards of censorship of its time. So it's quite. It's about as shocking as it could get without breaching the kind of codes of standards that the film industry was subjected to at the time. So there are very brief glimpses of, say, for instance, some severed hands on barbed wire and so on. But a lot of the gruesome nature of the war is has to be imagined rather than seen. Another thing in this book, which again this one only sort of touches on to an extent, but these two don't really at all, is the sort of the dirt and grime and literally the excrement and so on that soldiers have to deal with. The sort of public latrines, as it were, the communal latrines, I suppose you could say, but they were public as well. None of that is really in here. There is a scene in this one where Balmer and Kat are sat side by side on a loo reading letters and so on. In here, they actually, when they're away from the front line, they actually form the sort of thunderboxes into circles and sit there for hours playing cards and so on, whilst they're sat on the loo. None of that is shown in this, just because it would be considered slightly distasteful, as it were. But Baumer uses it as a way of demonstrating how behaviour and so on changes, how sort of social norms change when you're in conflict and you're in that situation. So again, it's talking about how how that generation were literally their sort of mentality and their social norms were altered, irretrievably, really. But in here, if you have read the book, which I now realise, there are lots of references to the book in here, which would go unnoticed if you didn't know the book. So, for instance, Remarque writes about how the soldiers would risk their lives to collect parachutes from the flares, and they would do that for the material, for the silk or whatever it was made of, and also for the copper bands around shell casings and so on. So on, they would collect those. I mean, this one, but there's a character called Chadden, who at one point literally holds up a copper band, but you don't pick up on the reference unless you read the book. He doesn't refer to it himself, other than to say he's going to get a woman whose leg, whose leg would fit into this copper band or something like that. After the war, so this particular version is, I would say, is quite close, true to the book. The episodes are in a very similar order. There is a lot of scenes on the kind of home front. So there's the leave scene. There's a whole passage where the postmaster of the town that he was a boy in becomes a kind of corporal in the training camp, and is a very kind of authoritarian, bullying figure who they all hate and eventually get their revenge on. That's in here. There's a character called Himmelstos who actually gets moved to the front line eventually. I won't go into that too much because it's really not the point. What I'm trying to say is that this copies the book quite well, and I think it's a very good, sort of rendition of the book. And as I say, the audience at the time wouldn't have had access to television, so they would either have picked up the story of the book and got most of its meaning and most, the whole purpose that Remarque wrote the book. I think that comes across in here, because Baumer is the narrator in this. They have to get around that a different way. So often Baumer is praying to God, literally saying, why is this happening, and why did this person have to die, and all that kind of thing. That's not in here because that's basically his prayers are a kind of device in order for the viewer to be able to hear his thoughts spoken out loud, as it were. Now, this version here came out in 1979. It wasn't this film. The original was a great success. This wasn't a particularly great commercial success, but obviously the audience has changed by this time because they're watching it on TV. The technology has changed because it's in colour. There is a little bit more leeway in terms of the graphic nature of the fighting that they can show. The special effects are better, the explosions and so on. That's not to say that this one doesn't have some sort of fairly realistic battle scenes in it. It does. But this one is kind of more technically accomplished, I suppose you could call it. But it's a lot flatter, a lot blander. It's more of a war movie rather than an anti-war movie. Even though, and I think that's partly because by the 1970s, TV and cinema had gone through this whole period. I mean, largely influenced, I suppose, by All Quiet on the Western Front. They wanted to portray war realistically, so they did so by showing, very disillusioned soldiers, lots of cynicism in war movies, as much kind of blood and gore as they were allowed to show. So it's a lot of the episodes in All Quiet on the Western Front are beginning to lose their kind of shock effect. So by the time you get around to watching this, you're kind of more used to hearing negative speeches from soldiers about their commanders or about the state of the war. There's lots more disillusionment, and you expect it. In 1930, you didn't expect it. It was something, quite shocking, and shocked the Nazis profoundly, who wanted kind of unquestioning loyalty and obedience, and fighting to the death kind of thing. Which is the other thing about the Nazis, really, that their whole attitude to the First World War and Germany's surrender was that the German army had been stabbed in the back by the civilian government and the mutinous kind of populations, behind the lines, and the German army was prepared to fight on, which they weren't at all. Everything had absolutely crumbled by the end of the war. But the Nazis maintained this myth of being stabbed in the back, largely as a result of Hindenburg and his revision of his own account of how the war had ended, how the decision to surrender had come about. And Hindenburg, of course, was the Chancellor who allowed Hitler's government to come to power. So yeah, this is it's an all right film, but it's more of a kind of run of the mill. It's a run of the mill kind of film, run of the mill story, even though the story is very closely aligned to here. It's the structure of the plot and so on. It's very similar. It's got a great many of the similar kind of episodes. They've just sort of transferred them across and updated them. So in a way, this, rather as the TV version of Dr. Zhivago was a kind of homage to the original film rather than to the book, this is a homage to the original film rather than to the book. Now we come to this one here now. And this, I still don't know what I think about this film. It is very untrue to the book in terms of the structure of the plot. So, and also there are lots of things added into the film which aren't in the book. So in a way, they didn't really need to call it All Quiet on the Western Front. The reason I think they've kept the title is that all those episodes that I mentioned and lots that I haven't mentioned are all condensed into the last week of the war. So that almost the entire book happens in a week, whereas in the book, in these films, they happen over 4 years. In this, they happen in a week. So the film starts off with a very kind of, I don't know. I think the the producer and the director were intending to produce a film that stood up in its own right, that wasn't just a simple reiteration of the book, the story from the book, with enhanced special effects and cinematic devices and so on. They wanted to actually produce a standalone work of art. So the film begins with an image of a forested area of countryside, and you very rapidly, I think in the distance, I think you can hear thunder and lightning. I don't think it's meant to be gunfire, because you very rapidly, the camera goes underground, and you're suddenly in the den, is it, of a vixen and her cubs. I'm not sure the technical name for a fox's lair, whether it's a den or a lair or whatever, burrow. But anyway, you're underground, watching a fox suckling, a vixen suckling her cubs. Doesn't really seem to be any great reason for that to be. And if you read accounts of the lengths they went to in order to acquire that scene, they actually had to grow a vixen accustomed to living with a camera in a specially designed, I suppose it was like a box that they put her in, even before her cubs were born, so that the cubs and the mother, the parent, were accustomed to the presence of the camera. And it's really, sort of almost pointless. But what happens is the camera then lifts up, ascends vertically, so it's obviously like a drone camera, vertically rising out of the ground and up into the sky, looking down on the trees. And you see something like a raindrop or something like that fall to the ground, and suddenly the camera switches upwards and then back downwards again, and you're looking at a scene of devastation, a battlefield. So I think I think the camera is attempting to tell you that you're looking at the same piece of earth once the war has started. But cinematically, it's kind of a neat bit of cinema, I suppose, but has no relevance to the story of, or the story or the kind of message of All Quiet on the Western Front. But anyway, you then go back onto this battlefield, and you're seeing corpses on the ground being riddled with bullet fire, and then you're suddenly in the German trench, following a particular character who is not a character from the book, and you follow him going over the top, fighting with the French, hand-to-hand fighting, and you don't see him being killed. I don't think you do, but you know his name because he's been given a command by one of the officers, so you know his name. And anyway, the scene then switches to corpses being collected and buried in coffins, but before they're buried, they are stripped of their boots and their clothing and so on, and it's all bundled up and put onto trains, and these vast quantities of bloodied and damaged clothing are taken back to Germany, presumably, and laundered and repaired, restitched and repaired and so on, and then given back to a fresh wave of troops. So what you're doing is you're following the clothing of this character who has been killed, and that clothing eventually goes to Paul Baumer, who once is recruited, which is in 1917, is recruited, not in 1914 in the actual story. So he goes up to the administrator at the desk and says, "Oh, look, I've got someone else's clothing here. It's still got the name of this chap in." And the guy just says, "Oh, it was probably too big for him. Happens all the time," and tears the name off, drops it onto the floor where there are a whole pile of name tags on the floor. So it's a cinematic device for showing the kind of machine-like processing of soldiers and recruits through to their death, and then repurposing their clothing. So it's quite a good way of showing the kind of the impersonal nature of the whole, and the kind of scale of the losses on the battlefield, but not really terribly relevant to the original book. Then you go on to Paul going to the front with his classmates. None of the training, none of the Himmelstoff, Corporal Himmelstoff, and the brutality of the training regime and so on shown. He's straight into the fighting from there, from the minute he puts his uniform on. And there are lots of scenes that episodes that don't appear in the book. Maybe they're equally powerful. I don't know to what Remark wrote, but they're kind of an unnecessary overburdening of the plot in a way. One of the classmates is killed almost straight away, and then you skip from mid-1917, fast forward to I think it's November the 4th. Yeah, 7 days before the end of the war, November the 4th, 1918, and then it begins to play through all of the episodes, or not a lot of the episodes that are in this book, such as the troops returning to the canteen, the mobile canteen, and being able to have double rations because half of them have been killed in the time that it's taken the cook to prepare the meal. But again, not in the same way, and not with the same kind of nuance as in the book. Other episodes, like there's an episode in the book and in these two films where the soldiers have a sort of dalliance with three French girls who are interested in the soldiers because they have food that they can eat. That's not in here at all, other than three French girls walk past a group, the group when they're behind the lines, and one of the characters goes off with them, but none of the others do. So it's kind of altered and mutated, and works quite well. But the whole point about condensing everything to the last week of the war in this film is that they introduce a completely new element to the plot, which is that they're showing the negotiation of the armistice. So they're showing the German delegation led by Erzberger travelling to the campaign, the Forest of Campaign, and requesting an armistice from Foch and the intransigence of the Allies, and the sort of brutal terms that they enforce on the Germans in order to agree to an armistice and so on. And in the time that those negotiations are ticking away, all of the characters, all of the principal characters in this book are slowly being killed off. So here they're showing the sort of unnecessary, waste of life. All those lives could have been spared had the armistice, been negotiated more swiftly. In those last 7 days, they all die. Now, I think I said earlier that Paul Bauer in the book and these two films dies in October 1918. So it's quite a massive. The story ends in October 1918. So the film is really all set outside of the period that the book covers. The other thing that they've done is incorporate a lot. The whole business of showing all these additional characters like Erzberger and the Foch and the negotiations and the delegations at in Compiègne, is that it reminded me immensely of another book called Gossip from the Forest by Thomas Keneally, which is actually about just that subject. It's about the armistice negotiations. And I couldn't say for sure, but I think they've lifted a lot from this book, which was incidentally dramatised itself. There is a TV adaptation of this book. It's very hard to get hold of it. I haven't seen a DVD of it. It was 1979, same year as this, coincidentally. It was on ITV. I think it was Granada Television produced it, and it was in the screenplay series. It's about an hour and a half long. You can find it on YouTube if you search for it. So I've watched it again recently on YouTube, but I can remember seeing it way back in 1979, and it's a very good book, and it has the feel of it is very similar to the feel of the armistice scenes in this book. But the whole point of, I think, of them putting it in is not only to show the unnecessary sacrifice of life, but it's to kind of deliver the message that the Second World War was almost inevitable because of the way the First World War ended and the over severe terms that the Allies imposed on the Germans. And that is a very valid point to make. As I said earlier, the First and the Second World War wars were really the same conflict. So it's a very valid thing, statement to make. But at the same time, you have to get around this awkward problem that Germany during the Second World War was governed by Hitler and the Nazi Party. So any kind of moral high ground had been completely surrendered. So there's a bit of a dichotomy there. But this is a German film, and it's important that the Germans are able to express their own version of events. So they're not so much, this film is not so much, or it's sort of equally concerned with describing how the war ended, because that was so important to later German history, as it is to portraying the grim reality of war in general, which the original book did. And then the other thing that they've added into this is that there is a German, a sort of Prussian military officer character who is determined, who is absolutely livid with the fact that the Germans are about to surrender, and is determined to fight to the end and to throw as many men as he can into the fight. So there's a final offensive that Paul Baumer is inevitably sort of thrown into and killed in, and Paul Baumer actually dies. He's bayoneted through the heart in this sort of hand-to-hand fighting sequence just before the ceasefire is called at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, and dies just after the armistice comes into effect. So the whole thing is done for kind of dramatic effect, really. A bit like Dr. Zhivago's death in the film, differing from the book. It's done to kind of exaggerate that element of tragedy and sort of unnecessary loss. And there's a little bit of a kind of sequence after that where a new recruit is collecting dog tags and so on, and fails to collect Paul's, which means that his death isn't recorded in the official statistics, but that's by the by. So as I say, I am really in two minds about this. I think that there's a lot more portrayal of the gruesomeness, the special effects and so on, and the ability to shock audiences is, as time has gone on, audiences are far more kind of hardened to seeing bits of cadaver and so on in the scene. So there's a lot of kind of gruesome footage, but it doesn't have the impact, I think, that it's necessarily intended. And this was one of one of the things that how Remarque's original book was approached. That there was a danger of going over a kind of a line where the book becomes sensationalist, and Remarque doesn't really do that, but I think this last film maybe does. So it becomes a bit like sort of war porn. It's sort of catering for enthusiasts of war movies. So a bit like this film, second version, it's a sort of bit of a kind of nasty, gruesome war movie than it is an anti-war movie. So I think it's kind of defeating its own object, to an extent. And while we're on a similar theme, that the as I say, the audiences have changed a lot and are more kind of callous to scenes like that. But they're also there's a lot more kind of interest, I think, in military history nowadays. So I'm sure there will be a lot of people who watch this film not because they're interested in the story or the moral of the story. They're more interested in just seeing scenes of fighting on the Western Front, and they would probably find this film quite unsatisfactory in a way. Yes, there are some good fight sequences that they would, be into, but there are a lot of inaccuracies with history in terms of the objective nature of history that I was talking about much earlier. So the accuracy of the portrayal of, say, the tanks. There are tanks in this film. There's a whole sequence where a wave of tanks attacks the Germans, which tanks are mentioned in the book, but you don't ever get to see them. In here, they appear in waves, and they're totally ridiculous. They don't look anything like any of the kind of historic models of a tank that you would have seen in the actual First World War, and also a kind of really sort of overkill, literally overkill, in terms of use of flamethrowers. There's one scene where it's adjacent to the scene with the tanks, where there's a whole army, it seems, of Frenchmen, all kind of armed with flamethrowers, using them really as sort of like a inter kind of personnel weapon, a weapon for hand-to-hand fighting almost, rather than what they were intended for, which was to be used, to clear out bunkers and entrenchments and so on. They're literally using them out in the open to deliberately, sort of burn German soldiers rather than shoot them. So it's unnecessarily graphic, it's inaccurate, it does shock, but didn't actually, the flamethrowers weren't used in that way. In the book, there is an incident where the platoon commander, I think he's a captain, is killed to sacrifices himself by leaving the crater that all his soldiers are in, which has got oil at the bottom, and he knows that if this flamethrower gets close to them, they will all perish. So he goes out and picks off the flamethrower from outside the trench, and is then killed by rifle fire. But that's the only, I think, as far as I remember, that's the only reference to a flamethrower in the book. So some of this film works for me, some of it doesn't. I don't think it's very true to the book. In a way, I thought a good idea might have been, they did have to negotiate the film rights to the book before they made it, and I think they had a lot of difficulty raising funds for it, so it took quite a long time for this film to be made. But the original title of All Quiet on the Western Front was actually nothing new on the Western Front. I can't remember what the original German title was Im Westen nichts Neues, excuse my German pronunciation, which kind of roughly translates as nothing new on the Western Front. Maybe it would have been a good idea to use that title rather than All Quiet on the Western Front, and then they could have more easily got away with the way they manipulated the plot and introduced another story into it in terms of the negotiations of the armistice. So that would have been my suggestion. The only other thing maybe to talk about in terms of the technology is that this was launched on Netflix. So even though it's a film and it's very cinematic, it was launched by a streaming service, which is another kind of indicator of the way the audiences have changed over the years. That when this first one came out, there was no TV. When this one came out, even though it was made for cinema type film, it was only available to TV owners. I don't think it was on in many theatres. Certainly wasn't locally to me. And it's only now come out a year after it was released on DVD for people who don't subscribe to Netflix or don't stream, which I don't, in order to be able to see it. So there's kind of a monetary factor and having to appeal to a particular audience. Netflix probably quite keen to have it and keep the title, the recognised title. so that they can get subscribers, because I think they're struggling a little bit at the moment. So there's kind of a commercial driver to this that you have to be aware of. Whereas, this film and this book were, iconic. As I say, in the Hollywood version of War and Peace, they even transfer the episode when Baumer carries Kaczynski to the dressing station, only to find that he's died en route. They transfer that into the Hollywood version of War and Peace, with Bazukov carrying someone equally in vain to a dressing station, only to find he's dead on arrival at the dressing station. So an iconic work which has kind of influenced a lot of later film and literature. But strange how it's had less influence on this latest version that has the title. So anyway, that's my very long review of 3 films and books, and the difficulties and the pitfalls of transferring history to a novel, and then the historical novel to film and TV. So that's there. The main things I would stress are there's a sort of triangular relationship between all 3. Truth and accuracy are most important. Censorship, either passive or active, has an immense role to play, and technological changes plus the demands of the audience and the commercial driver have altered things as the years have gone by as well. So apologies for the length of this, but as usual, I do have a lot to say, and spend a long time saying it. So thanks for watching, and see you on the next video. Bye for now.